So welcome everybody. I'd like to introduce our next PCA guest lecturer, Doug Galasko. I've been kind of hunting him down for a few months now to give a talk, and he's consented to talk to everybody about what he does. So he studies frontotemporal dementia and other rare dementias like PCA, and some of you know him from, he's at University of California, San Diego, and he'll talk to us about what he does and why he studies PCA and the research, some of the research that he conducts. So welcome, Dr. Galasko.
Great, thank you very much. So I thought I would cover a few things. I had a survey of your excellent website, and there's a lot of terrific information there. I know from interacting with patients that there are a lot of resources out there that folks are aware of. So I'm sort of not going to cover everything, and some of what I say will likely be redundant and well known to all of you, in which case forgive me. So I'm going to talk a little about what I think about regarding PCA when I see somebody who is referred with PCA as a potential diagnosis, how I would go through the workup, some of the things we would talk about, what I would do with regards to treatment and other strategies, and then talk a little about what might happen as things progress over time. I'm then going to talk a little about some of the research questions that come up about PCA in particular, and then I'm going to put it into a framework of research into Alzheimer's disease and some of the things that I'm involved in with regards to biomarkers, clinical trials, and so forth. So to begin at the beginning, as you all know, I'm assuming, posterior cortical atrophy is a collection of symptoms, and we put it together as a syndrome. We think of it most often as a variant of Alzheimer's disease. So probably 90% of the time at least, someone who comes in with what looks like pretty clear posterior cortical atrophy will have Alzheimer's disease pathology going on. The difference from typical Alzheimer's disease is that the tau pathology, the tangles that are building up for some or other reasons, are starting at the back of the brain rather than in areas that are typically involved in memory and learning. And there are a host of possible symptoms and things that can go wrong with how vision is organized and perceived as a result of this early pathology. And as I'm sure many of you have seen from the website, or as you've read more and found out more about PCA, there are different kinds of visual symptoms, visuospatial or visuoperceptive symptoms, sometimes difficulty in judging where things are in space, sometimes difficulty with numbers, which would be a rarer sort of version. And one can come up with an enormous number of initial symptoms, which actually can make the diagnosis much, much harder, especially if the first medical encounter somebody has is with a physician, either a generalist or a specialist, who is not all that familiar with PCA or even with vision. And very often, because vision seems to be affected, people start their journey towards a diagnosis by having their eyes checked, by seeing an optometrist, an ophthalmologist. Sometimes, and it can be unfortunate, if there is a little bit of coexisting eye pathology, so if somebody happens to have an early cataract or glaucoma or some other cause of visual problems, sometimes those can be misattributed to what's going on. And I have seen one or two patients who actually underwent surgery for glaucoma, which didn't correct the problem, and then eventually saw another ophthalmologist or two who was a little more savvy and thought, oh, this is not an eye problem, this is a brain problem. So it's not easy to get the appropriate expertise right away, unfortunately. And I think many of us are trying to work to educate professionals, in particular, people who see middle-aged and older patients with cognitive problems would be one group, and the other group would be optometrists and ophthalmologists about what might be going on. So in terms of lumping together all of these different kinds of symptoms and things, I think there are two broad clusters of symptoms in PCA, at least in my opinion. One of them is the what of vision. So some people have difficulty with actually reading, with seeing complex scenes well, with being able to perceive things that are in their visual space. The other is the where, and this can be difficulty with manipulating objects, with reaching into something and pulling out the right object, with using tools and things like that. I'll give you one striking example was a patient I saw some years ago, whose occupation actually was a radiologist. And after a number of adventures, she came to see me, and she told me that her earliest symptom was that she had an enormous amount of difficulty braiding her granddaughter's hair. And she couldn't figure this out because her hands were strong. She could use them to do other things. She just couldn't seem to figure out what went where. And as one delved into everything a little more deeply, a number of other visuoperceptual symptoms emerged. So there are other reasons for a delay in diagnosis. One of the other ones is that people who develop PCA vary in the range of onset of symptoms, but often they can be younger than our usual expectations for somebody with Alzheimer's disease. And so if one sees somebody with the onset of symptoms of cognitive or other changes in their 50s, for example, or early 60s, Alzheimer's isn't always the first thing that comes to mind. Sometimes people will be worked up for all sorts of other things. Sometimes these first kinds of symptoms can be associated with feelings of being anxious or sleep difficulty or other kinds of things, and sometimes there will be a diversion in all of those directions. So that can be another reason for a delay in getting a diagnosis. One of the other things I think that happens is sometimes the initial symptoms are put into a very broad basket instead of being delved into very deeply. So I've seen people, for example, where the first symptom might have been difficulty with driving. And the question then would be, well, what was the problem? And so next thing, the family member said, well, they had a few fender benders that they couldn't explain. Well, that can happen for all sorts of reasons. I've seen many patients with Alzheimer's disease who have had fender benders. But then if one starts to delve more deeply, well, the person was having trouble in a parking lot. They seem to have trouble figuring out how to back the car in or pull out. They seem to have trouble getting into the garage at home and things like that, had trouble changing lanes on a freeway. So if one delves a little more deeply, one can get an idea that this isn't simply an attention problem or a problem with memory or distraction, but there actually is something going on with visual perception. Certainly, because people may have a relatively younger age at onset, one may have symptoms such as difficulty using a cell phone or a computer or difficulty at work. And again, digging deeper into exactly what the nature of the symptoms actually is can be helpful to try and narrow down what could be going on. And then, for example, if somebody said they have difficulty reading, in the sort of Alzheimer's sphere, one might think that they're able to read information, but they will have a difficult time remembering it. One might not delve more deeply than that. Somebody in the earlier stages of PCA might have difficulty with scanning words appropriately, but in fact will be able to follow and recall and retain all of the material that they do read perfectly well. Or if they hear things, since the material is now coming into their brains through a different pathway, they'll be able to retain and remember stories or auditory material without any problems. So I think that it's well worth spending some time dissecting out the history. And so one of the things that I and some of my colleagues at UCSD do is see a fair number of folks who are referred for younger onset of cognitive problems. So when we see people with gradual onset of problems with speech or language or visual perceptive issues or memory or whatever, I think one of the big questions is to try and put things into as precise a category as is possible, and really get a handle on what areas of the brain, what kinds of pathways might be causing difficulty, and what sorts of areas are relatively intact, because this is going to influence our further workup. So what I would typically do then, having gotten a hint that there was a gradual onset of the kinds of problems that we've been talking about, and there aren't histories of, there isn't a history of things like stroke or brain trauma or other kinds of explanations. As part of my office-based testing, I would do a cognitive exam, usually a variation on a screening exam plus some additional testing. If I have a notion that somebody has difficulty with some of the simpler visual tasks that we use in screening, for example, drawing a clock or copying intersecting pentagons or drawing a cube, I will often ask people to draw a number of other kinds of figures, sometimes complex intersecting ones, to get an idea of their visual perceptual abilities. I usually will recommend that somebody sees an ophthalmologist. Usually there are a couple of ophthalmologists I work with who are experienced with the concept of PCA. Although it's difficult for ophthalmologists to definitively test visual fields, they can often do so to a reasonable extent, and we can get an idea, for example, if somebody has a greater perceptual deficit on the right side of their visual field than the left. And there are little things like that that can help in giving some advice and planning. Also, I think it is a reasonable thing to try and optimize vision in general. So making sure that there aren't additional visual problems that could be corrected is very reasonable. I also will, depending on the initial stage and severity when I see somebody, I will often recommend neuropsychological testing. This is much more useful when somebody has milder deficits, as somebody has a much clearer picture, and often if they have a picture of PCA and difficulty in language and memory and other things, the added value of neuropsychological testing becomes somewhat less. So if I see somebody with a milder picture, for me, the neuropsychological testing will do several things. It will document in more detail than usually my clinic testing does exactly what the areas of weakness are with regards to vision, visual organization, copying, and tasks like that. But it also will give me an idea of how somebody does with tests of memory, language, and problem solving. And again, I try to work with neuropsychologists who are experienced, because certain neuropsychological tests are going to be artificially, or not artificially, are going to be difficult for patients with visual problems to perform. And sometimes patients will achieve a low score on a particular test, but not because of the element the test is trying to capture, because they're not really doing the visual tracking that was necessary, looking at pictures that they're supposed to name. They may have difficulty identifying all of the details, for example. So I think there's a certain amount of expertise in interpreting neuropsychological tests. Neuropsychological testing also gives me some extra information that can be helpful if we're going through decisions about certain difficult areas, like should somebody keep driving or not. Usually I would advise against driving in somebody with PCA relatively early, even if other aspects of cognition are intact, because vision is so critically important when one is driving. With regards to things like managing finances, using a cell phone and so forth, there can often be workarounds, at least in the beginning, but sometimes help from other people is necessary, sometimes to convert, for example, a visual stimulus into something that is an auditory one. So I put all of those elements together in terms of the clinical assessment, and then I would proceed to a brain MRI. So once again, with brain MRIs, I don't know if anyone in the call has had the experience with having had an MRI done and then it was read as being normal. And this is, again, a problem that we encounter. A number of radiologists are looking for and are conditioned to identify certain types of structural changes on the brain, and they will hedge or have very generic reports about an MRI and might not say that there's anything special about areas at the back of the brain, such as the parietal or occipital lobes. So I will generally want to review the MRI myself so that I can make my own judgment about whether I think there are some early changes or not. Having said that, sometimes when we make a very early diagnosis of PCA, the brain MRI may look extremely normal, so it's almost impossible to tell that there's anything unusual going on. Other tests can be obtained, and this depends on a number of different factors. One can look at brain glucose usage by doing a PET scan called an FDG PET. This is a test that can be covered if somebody has Medicare, but otherwise, if they're younger than a Medicare eligible age, it would need to be paid for out of pocket. And then an amyloid PET scan would be a very, very precise way of trying to establish whether there is Alzheimer amyloid pathology present or not. But amyloid PET scans are not covered by insurance at all. And so if somebody really, really wants to know, they would need to make a considerable payment out of pocket. Another approach is to do a lumbar puncture and examine CSF, which again can give an indirect readout for Alzheimer pathology. In some states, this is partly covered by insurance. In others, in California, it's not covered at all. And so there often is a fairly substantial copayment that would need to be made. So that would kind of be my initial diagnostic workup and approach. And I think what comes next would be somewhat individualized depending on what the patient does, how old they are, whether they're still working or not, what kinds of things they're interested in, hobbies, pastimes, and so forth, their social support system, and what stage they're at. So what are they capable of doing that will be, for one thing, safe? We don't want to put people in jeopardy of having an accident of some sort. For another thing, enjoyable. So sometimes one can have a very striking patient who I saw a couple of years ago was somebody who had been working as a waitress for several years. I think she was in her early 50s, had some or other poorly described difficulty finding her way around the restaurant, getting things organized, bring the right orders, whatever. Anyway, she was fired. She lost her social support system and within about 2 years became homeless. Eventually, about another year and a half later, she was placed in a county mental health facility and brought to me for a cognitive evaluation. And they had incidentally obtained a CAT scan of her brain. And on taking the history from her, she complained that she could hardly see things very well. She had a vague idea of people's faces. She could sort of begin to see the world around her. She was having some memory problems. She had had a depressed mood and some other kinds of symptoms. And on CAT scan, there was a very striking appearance of atrophy of the, the parietal and occipital lobes, so that the picture was clearly that of posterior cortical atrophy. And this would be a really sad example of what can happen to somebody if there isn't a reasonably early diagnosis and there isn't a good social support system. So getting back to sort of a more usual chain of events, when I'm meeting with the patient and their family members, I will disclose the diagnosis and we'll have a discussion about the various kinds of symptoms. And then I'm usually asked, well, what about the future? What can you tell us? We've read this, that, and the other. Sometimes people have read that there are 5 more years of life left and things like that. What I would say is that we don't know. It's very difficult to give an exact prognosis in people with PCA and with younger onset of Alzheimer's disease. And the usual range I give for anybody with Alzheimer's disease is somewhere between about 5 and 15 years for survival, and with outliers being some people who can survive for 20 years. And there are a number of factors that influence how somebody progresses. One of them seems to be how fast somebody seems to progress early in their course. In general, people who are progressing somewhat more slowly early in the course tend to also progress slowly for a longer time. One of the other factors is that when people develop PCA or younger onset of other kinds of pictures of Alzheimer's disease, and they're in their 50s or 60s and are in general good health, they often are able to function without showing physical decline, without having some of the sort of spiraling progression that one can see in people in their 80s with Alzheimer's disease. And so people in their 50s and 60s, I would suggest, should plan on trying to be functional and active for as long as possible. And one of the discussions that I have in terms of being functional is to try and get things done that are meaningful and important. And this might include a number of things that people might have been saving on their bucket list. So, for example, going on a big trip somewhere, doing some really life-important experience would be something that I would suggest go ahead while all of the logistics are reasonably feasible, and get out there and enjoy things. We'll often discuss what some of the safety aspects might be that are reasonable in this sort of situation, but I'm a strong proponent of those types of that type of more positive approach. I also recommend, in general, exercise or some level of physical activity, paying attention to diet in as much as is reasonable. We don't have absolutely rigid recommendations for diet for Alzheimer's disease, but in general, a Mediterranean type diet would be sort of my recommendation rather than sort of a hot dog and fast food diet. I recommend making sure that vascular health is under pretty good control, so managing blood pressure, cholesterol, and factors such as that. Trying to make sure that people are sleeping well. Sleep is a very important aspect that can account for day-to-day cognitive function, and there are more recent studies that suggest that sleep in some of the deeper phases of sleep may be important in actually clearing certain substances and potentially toxins from the brain. So sleep is very, very important. Cognitive and social stimulation are important as well. Social stimulation, I think, provided people have a reasonable kind of family and social and community ecosystem around them, I think they should be able to adapt. Some people will have to decide how much to let their friends, neighbors, and community know or not. I think in general, letting other people know if they're reasonably sensitive and caring can be helpful rather than trying to cover up. And then cognitive stimulation can be a little tricky in that, for example, if somebody has enjoyed reading or really doing things with their eyes, if they had a workshop at home and were really enthusiastic about making things, I think it can be difficult to find workarounds and adaptations. For readers, there are options of trying to present words and sentences in very big font, in single lines. One can try to adapt a Kindle or a Nook or some other reader to try and do that. There are some fonts that are a little friendlier than others. So this sort of fits into the category of visual tricks and visual workarounds. So the back of the brain does a bunch of things to integrate vision, and some of them are more resilient than others. Contrast and light sensitivity are things that are often much more resilient. So, for example, using dark backgrounds and bright colors for certain kinds of things can make it easier for somebody to find table settings and things like that. So getting back to reading, the other approach would be things like audiobooks and methods of that nature. So I also would recommend, in terms of environmental modifications, that again, everybody has their own lifestyle and things they do and whatever. Certainly the Facebook group, the information available through the folks at University College London, and some of the other people who have come up with wonderful improvised solutions is incredibly helpful. And I would advise any patient and their family to really connect with and hook up with all of these folks and organizations. Also think about joining a support group in general. So I think that would be kind of a holistic view about one aspect of treatment. Another aspect is going to be medications. So our medications for Alzheimer's disease, unfortunately, are very, very limited. We generally recommend some kind of cholinesterase inhibitor. Donepezil or Aricept is one example. Rivastigmine, which can be given as a transdermal patch in the form of Exelon, is another example. And these have been well studied in typical Alzheimer's disease. They show relatively small benefits in groups of patients. Sometimes I'll see somebody where the family and the patient really do notice some appreciable difference, but often it's more a question of the findings of the benefit is much more subtle, and we think of it as a way of keeping people at a particular functional level for longer. So maybe propping things up for a longer period. There actually has been a small clinical trial looking at donepezil in posterior cortical atrophy from the group at University College London. They did a trial comparing donepezil to placebo over, I believe, about 6 months. And they did show that there, at least given the limitation, even within the limitations of the clinical testing that we can do, they showed that there was a small statistical benefit in people who were on a cholinesterase inhibitor compared to placebo. So I would certainly recommend a cholinesterase inhibitor as worth a try. And for me, the limiting side effects would be gastrointestinal, but usually not much of anything else. I have tried a couple of other kinds of medications over the years without a whole lot of success. So I've had some patients who complained about their speed of visual processing, that they could initially seem to track from one word to another, couldn't quite keep up with material to be able to read properly. And I've wondered whether there could be some sort of attentional or connection aspect to what's going on. And so in the past, I have tried a few people on stimulants, such as modafinil or Ritalin. I have not found that there was a consistent or reproducible benefit, so I no longer advise something like that. Mood is important to think about, and two aspects of mood are anxiety, which may be part of the biology of some of the younger forms of Alzheimer's disease, or may also be a response to not being a master of one's visual environment. Anxiety and depressed mood are things that are treatable, and there are a host of medications that can be prescribed that are generally easy to put up with. So this would sort of characterize the earlier stages of somebody with PCA. As I've mentioned, progression varies a lot, and with progression, one will often see the emergence of additional symptoms. So some of these symptoms may be worsening of vision, so that somebody may become almost unable to read at all. They may be able to make out people's faces with much greater difficulty. They'll have great difficulty with organizing things in space. They may have difficulty, for example, eating food from a plate, may have to use their hands instead of utensils at some point. If the pathology involves other areas of the brain, there may be difficulty with language, with being able to produce the same range and repertoire of words as in the past. There may be difficulty with memory. Although generally language and memory tend to appear in what I would think of as the moderate stages of PCA. Other symptoms are more variable, but definitely can occur and are well worth talking about, discussing with physicians and figuring out if there is a workaround. In some patients, there can be what I call positive visual disturbances. So some people see shadows or flickering lights or other kinds of things. For some people, visual hallucinations may actually emerge, and sometimes these can be distressing. When this type of symptom occurs, there are medications that could be available. Some patients may develop behavioral changes, agitation, insomnia, disruptive behavior, sometimes delusions. Again, these are much more likely to emerge in more moderate to advanced stages, and there may be medications that can be used to try to control these symptoms. The range of medications we have is not optimal, and we generally try to use medications at the lowest, most reasonable dose without trying to cause too much in the way of things like sedation or slowing of movement and balance. Some people may develop changes in movement as things progress. Changes in walking are common, but often they're simply because people become more cautious. There isn't necessarily a neurological basis for changes in walking. Some patients do develop a movement disorder that we call myoclonus. So myoclonus is a sort of rhythmic kind of jerk, very often affecting fingers or hands, sometimes the whole body. Usually it's something that is simply cosmetically present but doesn't necessarily have an impact on people. In a few people, the myoclonus can be a little more striking, can almost throw them out of a chair. If it gets to be that severe, then there are medications available, but generally we would not recommend treatment for myoclonus. So I think that would sort of cover a lot of the medical aspects of my approach as there are changes in progression of symptoms. And again, along the way side, I will be having discussions with patients and their family about what sort of additional help might be needed. Help from other family members, help from caregivers, and at some point questions about full-time help of some sort or another, either in-home help or help in terms of in terms of placement in a long-term care facility. So I think I'm going to change track a little. That would sort of cover kind of the nuts and bolts of what I do when I'm talking to and managing people with PCA. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research questions that arise regarding PCA in specific, and then regarding PCA where it is a sort of variant of Alzheimer's disease. So a question for which the short answer is we don't know is, why do people get PCA? So there's been a fair amount of speculation. Does it run in families? The answer to that one appears to be no. I've never, and certainly no colleagues that I've spoken to, have seen familial cases of PCA where a parent and their child or a set of siblings came down with PCA. In the Alzheimer's realm, there are families with very young onset of Alzheimer's disease due to genetic mutations. And these unfortunate families will have Alzheimer's with onset somewhere between the age of about 30 and 45. And if you're a gene carrier, you will invariably get Alzheimer's disease if you belong to one of these families. I have not yet seen a report in familial Alzheimer's disease of this nature of the presenting symptoms actually being PCA, which is kind of curious and unusual. So usually we think of Alzheimer's again as something that begins in an area called the temporal lobe or the hippocampus that is important in memory and learning. Some variants of Alzheimer's involve language, and they would begin in a slightly different area of the temporal lobe. But why does PCA develop where it does? Again, the short answer is we don't know. A couple of speculative questions that can arise. So it's not genetics, it's not family history. How about anything to do with use it or lose it? So if I think of people, I've seen some speculation that are people who develop PCA at risk because they've had some trouble with their visual perceptual system earlier in their life, developmentally, whatever, and something then goes wrong and there's degeneration. So if I think back to patients who I have personally seen, I can actually only think of one possible example. The person was actually a pretty successful businessman who had not been able to read very well, and he'd come up with some creative workarounds, and he had people who helped him, but otherwise he was very, very savvy and certainly had not had major trouble at college. I have seen people who, as I mentioned before, I saw someone who was a radiologist, architect, physicist, physicians. So I've seen some highly successful and accomplished and highly well-educated people with PCA, and I don't think that there's anything, at least from the spectrum of people I've seen and from talking to some colleagues, that would lead me to suggest that there's something developmentally that could act in some way as a risk factor. Certainly dyslexia is not at all uncommon, and if dyslexia was going to be a predisposing factor, I think one would imagine that PCA would be actually much, much more common than it actually is. One thing that I started to look at with a couple of colleagues, and then we ran out of the ability to do so. So when certain diseases begin in certain areas of the brain, one factor that might happen is certain neurons or nerve cells might carry too many copies of a particular gene. So normally every neuron we think of is alike, and neurons stop dividing after a certain point, but they do go through several cycles of dividing before they stop. And certainly in the epilepsy world, where some people with epilepsy have very small malformations in their brain that can act as focuses or foci of seizures, it's been shown that when some of these foci were surgically removed, and DNA analysis was done, some of the nerve cells actually had an extra copy of certain kinds of genes. So is it possible that somebody who's going to do a PCA maybe has some variability in their neurons in the back of the brain, and that they're carrying an extra copy of something in some susceptible group of neurons, and over time, perhaps this predisposes to the development of some of the kinds of pathology that we see with aggregation of the tau protein and the development of tangles and other things. So we started looking at some of the autopsy samples that we had, and it's extremely difficult to do so. The technology for isolating nerve cells and doing this analysis is still a little controversial. So this is something that we haven't been able to pursue as fully as we would like to, but it would remain one potential explanation for why PCA might develop. I mean, another explanation that isn't a very good one is simply random bad luck. That something statistically happened to occur in a particular group of nerve cells in a particular kind of PEEP in a certain person, and this triggered the onset of everything else. I think I'd like to leave that at the bottom of the list of possibilities and try to investigate some other things. So regarding genetics, there have been a few attempts to try and compare PCA to Alzheimer's disease, and I think a number of you probably heard from the group at University College of London, who organized a study where they obtained DNA from a number of investigators from around the world, including San Diego. We sent in samples from people who had PCA. They looked at the genetic makeup. They found that ApoE4, which is a risk factor for Alzheimer's, is also a risk factor for PCA, although a little less strongly than for Alzheimer's. And the DNA still exists, and people are looking for other kinds of clues and hints. But in fact, to do this sort of analysis, we may need to multiply the number of patients who we've actually looked at until we're looking at hundreds or even thousands of samples to have a good chance of detecting something. So what we really are hoping for, and this is sort of bringing PCA back into the Alzheimer realm, is that we're going to come up with a disease-modifying treatment that tackles the underlying problem. So the underlying problems in Alzheimer's disease, at least the ones we can identify through brain pathology and nowadays through biomarkers, are the accumulation and aggregation of a protein called amyloid and the accumulation and aggregation of a protein called tau. There's a fair amount of evidence that suggests that the tau protein, after it accumulates and aggregates, actually spreads, perhaps from one nerve cell to another, certainly from one brain area to another. And these two processes are driving a lot of research and have, certainly the amyloid area has driven a lot of approaches to trying to treat Alzheimer's disease over the years. Unfortunately, we do not have a successful disease-modifying treatment for Alzheimer's. There are many attempts to treat amyloid and try to remove it. So far, these have been negative. There was recent news about an antibody called aducanumab that is able to remove amyloid from the brain. And 2 clinical trials were completed. Actually, they were completed by the end of, almost completed by the end of last year. There was a planned analysis before they were completed, and this analysis was called a futility analysis to try and predict whether the trial had a chance of eventual success or not. They declared futility, wrapped up the trial, but continued to collect data over the next 3 months. And about a month ago, we heard that the data had been reanalyzed and that people who were on the highest dose of aducanumab showed a benefit compared to people who were on a placebo. This has been controversial. The full set of data has not yet been released. There were 2 different studies of aducanumab. In one of the trials, all of the things that were looked at, all of the clinical outcomes and some of the biomarkers all showed differences compared to people on placebo in the high-dose group. In the other clinical trial, there were trends, but absolutely no statistical significance. This is sort of not the kosher way of doing clinical trials, and some people have said that the company should not try and slice and dice and stir their data. They need to do another trial if they're going to be definitive, but we shall see what happens. There will be some discussions with the FDA. One thing we have learned from this trial is that it is possible to remove a substantial amount of amyloid from the brain, at least with this antibody, and this will likely inspire further efforts. There are emerging clinical trials to try and tackle the problem of the protein tau. Several of these trials are just beginning. One trial that was completed looked at whether an antibody could try and prevent the spread of tau or could remove tau. And unfortunately, that antibody didn't work. That was the first attempt to do so. We are going to see a number of further clinical trials in the tau arena, some of which are emerging right now. And one thing that is going on is clinical trials for Alzheimer's are generally open to including people with posterior cortical atrophy if they qualify and have biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease. So I think I'll stop there and open things up to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Galasko. That was beautiful. I'll just start off with the first question, and that is, from meeting all the different types of patients you've met over the years, has there been anything shared in terms of their developmental history, in terms of their phenotypes, that you can say, you know, like with primary progressive aphasia, these people, you know, had language problems growing up.
So actually, I would dispute that people with primary progressive aphasia have language problems growing up. I haven't uniformly seen that, and I would say that's an interesting theory that not everybody would affirm. But apart from the one example I gave of a particular businessman who had reading difficulties, I actually have not been impressed at all with any kind of visuospatial abilities. I haven't had stories that, for example, people couldn't compete at sports because they had bad hand-eye coordination or anything like that. I really haven't heard of any particular phenotype that stands out.
Okay, great. I'm going to take questions, and yes, Ivan, I'll unmute you again.
So something my whole life, and I started with this very young. I was in my late to mid 50s when I had this disease. And my whole life, I always felt like I was always rushing. And sometimes I thought I had ADD or something like that. And I wonder if that has something to do with this.
So regarding ADD, would you say that it had to do with things that involved reading or your eyes, or would it be things where if you were in a conversation that the hearing the conversation seemed to be difficult to process?
Yeah, I sometimes that, and just the fact that I just seemed to be very quick all the time. Always, my mind was always moving too quick for myself.
So it's sort of curious. Again, I think one way to dig into some of these sorts of things might be if folks who are part of like the Facebook group or other things might complete some sort of survey. But having said that, there is a bias. We're human, and we want to attribute things. We want to blame things on something. And certainly, I'm impressed by how often somebody tells me that symptoms began after some or other event, whatever that event was. They had a bad fever, or they had a little car crash, and something happened, or some particular event triggered everything. And I think we want to kind of connect the dots as humans. So when I haven't heard, I'd emphasize that I really haven't heard a consistent phenotype in the background of all of this.
Thank you, Ivan. Any other questions? Yes, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead.
I have to unmute myself. Yeah, so my husband has been diagnosed with PCA, and the one symptom that he has that I have not heard attributed to PCA before is trouble with his speech. But I don't mean trouble with his speech like trouble finding the word, like he can't remember the correct word. It's like he's stumbling over his words. He gets tongue-tied very easily. And I'm wondering if you have heard of that as a symptom at all, or whether you think that's a symptom of something else.
Does he have difficulty with the actual pronunciation, or does he stutter?
He sort of stutters, but it's more like he just, they're like spoonerisms. He like switches the letters of things. So he'll eventually get it, and he usually pronounces it correctly. In fact, I think he always pronounces it correctly. So it's not a matter of like substituting the wrong vowel or something like that. It's literally just that he stumbles, and then he twists the letters around.
I mean, certainly there are language changes that could happen, especially if the pathology is getting closer to the temporal lobes, which would be language related areas. So the one variant of Alzheimer's disease that causes language problems is called logopenic variant of progressive aphasia, which is a sort of tongue twister of a name all in itself. But in the logopenic variant, people sort of seem to have a paucity of content of their speech. So they'll speak fluently, they'll come up with reasonable sounding sentences, they'll seem to sometimes talk around a particular topic, they'll have trouble finding words, they may use the word thing instead of a particular name for something, and then they may come up with a sort of approximation of a name of an object. And I wonder if he may be showing a little bit of a very small overlap with some fragments of what I would think of as logopenic PPA.
Yeah, I've heard that described before, and the thing is that it's if there is an overlap, it just seems so minimal to me because of the fact that since he usually gets out some variant of the word, like you can tell what the word is, it's clearly in his brain. It's clearly there. He just can't get his mouth to coordinate enough to say it properly. But yeah, that is sort of the best.
Right. So in logopenic variant of PPA, people retain what is called word meaning. So in some variants of progressive language disorder, progressive aphasia, people actually lose the actual concept of what a particular word is, so that they wouldn't be able to come up with a workaround or a very similar sounding word. So if they were looking at a drawing of, let's say, a giraffe, they might be able to say it's an animal, but they might not be able to give any other characteristic, whereas someone with logopenic variant might say something about long neck, lives in Africa, and a couple of other things.
Mm-hmm.
If they're given the starting letter, they may come up with the word. And I wonder if he's showing more of a fraction of that kind of picture.
All right, cool, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
Here has PCA, and she also has complex partial seizures. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the connection between PCA and people who are experiencing these mild seizures.
That's a tricky question as well. So seizures can occur at some or other point along the course of all of the different variants of Alzheimer's disease. Usually, if they do occur, they tend to occur in later stages, but I use the word usually because everybody's different. And I have seen people where there have been more mild or minor seizures, and sometimes complex partial seizures could fit this bill, earlier in the course. So they're not super common, but, and having said that, if I had a patient with PCA who started having seizures, I would probably want to get a brand new MRI of the brain to make sure there wasn't something else in an appropriate brain area that could be contributing to this. But the management and treatment of the seizure would be no different than if we had a complex partial seizure originating in some other kind of disorder.
Yeah, she's seeing an epileptologist and Dr. Grabowski up here in Seattle, and both of them recommend, treat the seizures. So she's on Keppra, and because one might be causing the other to get worse. They're not really sure what the connection is, but they're noticing that they're connected. I'm
not sure PCA should worsen seizures if they're going to be occurring, but I think certainly seizures, with seizures, we're only aware of the actual seizure phenomenon when it happens, but discharges in the brain that are causing seizures can sometimes be active on a more subtle basis, and sometimes that can make people not think as clearly, not function as well as they could. So I think it's very, very appropriate and reasonable to treat the seizures.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Marilyn.
Hi, JV. Thanks, Dr. Galasko. So wise as always. I wondered if you could talk a bit about the cortical basal degeneration and your observations about that, and then certainly about the emergence of co-pathologies and the impact of that and whether or not that's significant.
Sure. So I think one of the, in your case, if I may share a little, your husband was somebody who I saw with PCA, and he developed an unusual symptom. He had myoclonus, which I have mentioned can occur genetically in Alzheimer's, but he really had it much more markedly on one side of his body, and he also had some stiffening and abnormal positioning of the arm, and a number of other features that we put together in a disorder that is called corticobasal syndrome. So corticobasal syndrome is an unusual disorder. It's actually caused by the tau protein, the same one that gets up to mischief in Alzheimer's, but in corticobasal, it involves different kinds of cells in the brain in different regions. However, corticobasal syndrome is just that. It's a syndrome. It's a cluster of symptoms. And if any kind of pathology spreads to the appropriate brain areas, then one may see features of corticobasal syndrome emerging. So I think one of the takeaways of PCA in general is that for years, it will start out with symptoms that are confined to vision, visual perception, and that whole category. Over time, as the presumed tau pathology is spreading and involving nearby brain regions, there may be associated problems, memory, language, and sometimes very unusual things, such as myoclonus corticobasal syndrome. In terms of co-pathologies, so one thing that we think of when people have kind of changes in visual perception is a different disorder called dementia with Lewy bodies or Lewy body disease. This originally came out as sort of a variant of Parkinson's disease, and typically people with dementia with Lewy bodies have some difficulty with visual perception. It's nowhere near as dramatic as people with PCA, but they can have trouble with integrating things in space. But they will often have other kinds of symptoms that are absolutely characteristic, including some of the movement parts of Parkinson's disease. And they will be very likely to have visual hallucinations very early in the course. And these will be quite prominent and colorful visual hallucinations. Now, there's nothing to prevent somebody who has PCA from later developing a co-pathology. So somebody might also develop some Lewy bodies in one or other areas of their brain. Certainly in a percentage of people with Alzheimer's disease, other kinds of pathologies are eventually found at autopsy, including Lewy body pathology and another kind of pathology called TDP43, which we don't have any way of really clearly diagnosing in someone with Alzheimer's during life. TDP43 actually started out being something that was discovered in relation to Lou Gehrig's disease and to frontotemporal dementia. So some of the common themes are certain proteins in different kinds of nerve cells tend to stick to one another and aggregate. And sometimes these aggregations give us reasonably characteristic, fairly, for want of a better word, pure disorders, but sometimes there can be some overlap.
Wonderful. Thanks, Marilyn. We have a question from Sally and then from Sonia. Sally? I might have to unmute her. Sonia, do you want to go first then?
Does this work?
Yes, Sally, go ahead.
Yeah, so it was a very interesting presentation, and I wanted to go back to one of the earlier statements. In my current situation, there's a multitude of minor degenerative cognition, and it was only about 12 months ago that there was a very distinct symptom that got me investigating. And there was evidence of increased plaque, amyloid plaque in the occipital and parietal, and the cerebral fluid was a high risk of Alzheimer's. All the other tests were done and everything was clear, but there's multiple symptoms that point to the PCA and the medical profession sitting on the fence. Things I have done since then, I think my diet hasn't really changed much. But the big one is that I think I was having an average sleep pattern of around 6 hours a night, and I've made a concerted effort to move to an average of 8 hours a night, and that has had, I feel, a distinct improvement in my symptoms, particularly the more obvious ones. And you mentioned sleep patterns and the importance of sleep right at the beginning of your apprehension, and whether that can help recover some situations, because that's what I think I'm finding at the moment, even though I am still seeing progression in many things. More sleep is very beneficial. And that was the question, really.
Well, so I would agree with you. Sleep is a good thing. It's not clear what the optimal amount of sleep is for everybody, but 8 hours is probably would probably be our biological ideal. I don't know if we all can attain it. You mentioned that you were getting 6 hours, and the question is whether it was a high quality 6 hours or not as well. Sleep is both a mixture of quantity and quality, and if sleep is interrupted and you don't get into enough hours of deep sleep, it might also not lead to you're feeling as refreshed as possible, and then some carryover the following day. So I think certainly getting better and more regular and consistent sleep can only be beneficial.
Thank you, Sally. Sonia, you want to?
Yes, and actually, it's sort of ironic that I'm following that question, but I'm not going to speak about sleep. Hi, Doug. That was a fabulous talk. You said at the end, when we were talking about clinical trials, that PCA patients are now included. So as you and I well know, that's always been an issue because of the visual aspects of the MMSC tends to reduce it usually below the inclusion criteria. So is that changing?
Well, so let me qualify that. Someone with PCA would be included provided that they can score well enough on whatever the screening test is to get into the trial.
Yeah.
So depending on what the test is, so the mini-mental, the main visual aspects of the mini-mental are being able to read, close your eyes and do that, being able to write a sentence, and being able to copy intersecting pentagons, which in total are worth 3 points. But if people can do everything else, they may well be able to qualify on the mini-mental. The Montreal Cognitive Assessment, or the MoCA, would have me much more worried, because that has a full 5 points for an initial visual test, and that's right at the beginning of the test. So if somebody is feeling a little anxious or nervous, they may then underperform on other aspects. But assuming people with PCA can pass the screening level of cognition for a trial, then they would be appropriate. So a lot of trials are now going down to an age of 55 and sometimes 50.
Thank you.
And Dr. Apostolova gave a really great talk, and she's doing a national study, multi-center study. I don't know if Dr. Galasko is involved with that study, but if anybody wants to know about Dr. Apostolova's study, you can just email me and I'll get you in touch with her. Any other questions before? Yes.
I am wondering about the MIT study that came out very recently. It was
The gamma rays.
Well, it's about mice who got cured. I mean, literally, it was pretty, I mean, they really got cured from Alzheimer's using sound and light. And Science Friday, like 2 weeks ago, the podcast showed it, and it was very interesting. And the one of the big benefits, if there is a benefit, is that there is, it's so non-invasive. It's totally non-invasive, but they were pretty miraculous outcomes for the mice. And they've been working on this now for probably about 5 years, but this most recent test sounded, I don't know, it sounded very promising. That's all.
Sure. So the comment that I'll make is that unfortunately mice aren't people, And the mouse models of Alzheimer's disease only capture some of the kinds of changes that we see in people. They do capture some of the amyloid changes, but mice don't ever develop tangles, and they don't develop nerve cell loss and some of the other changes that people do. And so in order to make some of those changes happen, the poor mice undergo all kinds of additional genetic engineering and things so that they end up being able to model something, but it isn't quite faithful to Alzheimer's disease. So one has to start somewhere, and if one didn't have any initial signal in a mouse model, it would be worrisome. We have seen a number of things that did seem to have benefits in mice that have later gone on to human trials and have not been successful. So I would be cautiously optimistic about that one. I think one small comment would be that from a physical aspect, shining something through a mouse's skull, getting something into a mouse's brain is less of a challenge. The skull is thinner, the distance is less, and so forth. And scaling up to do human trials might be much more difficult. But we need new ideas, and I'm enthusiastic to see how this will translate into something.
Thank you. One more question, and that's going to be from Dave.
Yes. Doctor, you didn't mention how long do you keep your patients on the Alzheimer's medicine, such as Exelon patch and that? I mean, when you really, there's no way of measuring everything exactly. So is later stages, or how long do you normally keep them on the medicines?
So that's a great question. In clinical trials that were done using donepezil and some of the other medications, trials were done even in nursing home patients and measuring a few things that could even be measured in advanced Alzheimer's. They showed that there were subtle benefits and that the drugs could be shown to be doing a little bit of something even in advanced stages. I tend to kind of personalize and individualize my treatment. For me, I think it depends on how someone is spending their time, what they're able to do in terms of socialization, interactions with other people, and so forth. If I think there's a chance that the treatment is improving the meaningfulness of those sorts of interactions, I might encourage keeping it on board. If somebody's on a host of other medications, on the other hand, if there's a possibility of medication interactions, if there's any sign of diarrhea or things like that, then I would want to stop the medication.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm so glad I kept at it. And Marilyn, thank you so much for recommending Dr. Galasko. You were so right. So thank you all. I will see you in a couple weeks for our next support group. And thank you again, Dr. Galasko, for being our guest today.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was a great pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.